to another episode of Coffee with April. This time, we're going to discuss something that we get asked about a lot, and just a few days ago from now, I posted a post on Instagram asking, so what do you guys want us to talk about? And one of the things that I got the most respond on was how are we profiling our new coffees? And I figured since we're actually at a time in the year now where we get a lot of new coffees coming in, this could be a very interesting discussion. So basically, a lot of coffee now has been harvested from December to March, basically 2017 to 2018, right? And what we see is that more and more of that coffee is starting to come in to roasteries around the world and also here at April, which is a very fun and exciting time. And also a challenging time, right? Because it's a matter of getting new coffees into rotation as well as continuing doing production, right? So what we do here at April is that first of all, we try to buy as consistently as possible. So we want to work with farmers and coffees that we've been working with in the past for several reasons. First of all, because we believe it's more sustainable. Second of all, because it's also more fun and more interesting, we want to try to get to know the people we are working with and understand also what they can do to make the coffee better. So working with the same coffee from year to year is actually going to help you do this a lot better, because in an ideal situation, even though that is not always the case, that coffee is going to come out relatively consistent from time to time, right? So sometimes if you actually work with a crop back to back, the biggest challenge is not going to be the change in green coffee, because that could come out very similar. The biggest challenge could be the change of a machine setup, right? So you might have, changed your burner, you might have updated your piping, you may not have cleaned your pipes the way you should, and changed the dynamic in the machine. So a lot of people, what they do is they get the same coffee in and they start on the same profile, which, to be fair, is a good reference because it worked last year. Why wouldn't it work now? But then technically you roast on a different machine even if it's the same setup, because there's changes within that machine that are not allowing you to work that way. That being said, sure enough, you're building up a profile of different ideas and approaches, right? So we basically have a library where we kind of look at the green coffee, look at the quality of the green coffee, look at the measurements of the green coffee, and we try to always adapt that to previous roast, using the kind of curves, energy distribution, airflow concepts, fan concepts that we have been in the past. Now, a pretty common question as well is, where do you get those numbers? And we all know that measuring green coffee can be very expensive, unfortunately. There's two ways to look at this, and we are mainly working with number one, which is a green coffee supplier, whether that is a farmer, producer, importer, should be able to provide you with the measurements that are the most interesting. So when I say measurements, I'm talking about screen sizes, I'm talking about density, I'm talking about water activity, and a basic moisture reading, right? These are at least some of the most important variables that we know today that some people may or may not incorporate within their roasting, but we actually based quite a lot on these numbers. So if you can't get them from, again, farmer, producer, importer, you have the opportunity of also naturally measuring this yourself. If you are, go with the best stuff, right? Buying machines to measure accuracy, whether that's a TDS refractometer, a color tracker, whatever it might be, anytime you want to base whatever you do professionally on numbers, make sure that those numbers are as correct as they can be, right? So don't work with something that is not up to date in terms of quality. I think that's a very important part. But yeah, so go to your importer, ask for the numbers, it should be able to provide you. The challenge is that, for example, the moisture activity and to some extent the moisture, even if that happens very rarely in a very high grade specialty, could actually change with time, and therefore time and storage, I should say, and therefore it's actually relevant for you to make those measurements here as well. More specifically, back to profiling. There is a few different ideas about it around the world. Of course, I see a lot of them when I travel around doing consultancies. One question as well that I get asked a lot is whether we roast on a smaller system, like a sample roaster or something like that, and try to transfer those profiles onto a big roaster. I can say that we don't. There's very few systems in the world where that makes any kind of sense. Going for a very tiny, 500 gram, 100 gram, 1,000 gram system up to a 15 kilo, 35, 70, 120 kilo machine. It's just not transferable whether you like it or not. So therefore we spend very little time doing any kind of sample roasting in terms of profiles on smaller machines, which means we're going directly on the big one, right? Which in this case is not very big. However, key thing here, as I kind of mentioned before, stay on top of the machine, understand the performance of the machine, and make sure that that is similar or better than last year, right? Work with a similar or the same green coffee back to back is really going to improve your overall quality. And something that I've been stressing for a very long time now, use the same batch size. I cannot emphasize that enough, how important that factor actually is. You want to work with the same batch size because that will keep your roasting a lot more consistent. It's incredibly difficult to change batch sizes because how the probe is measuring the temperatures, how the burner actually affects the coffee is almost impossible. Simple stuff like it takes a different amount of time to cool down 6 kilos of coffee and 12 kilos of coffee. Then you need an equation that calculates how much faster that coffee cools down, because cooling down means interrupting the roasting process, and technically if you want two batches of the same coffee in different size to come out with the same result, you want them to cool down the same amount of time. That makes it very complicated, right? So stick with one batch size and you're going to be able to get a long way. And it's when it comes down to coffee, there's different ways to approach it, but one can say that, okay, so each coffee is very different, which to most degrees are actually very true. So each variable behind every single green coffee comes out very differently and is actually different. Therefore, we measure all these variables. Second of all, it's still coffee. And I say this because it's interesting to understand that it's actually still coffee. So coffee is reacting similar within the roasting process, almost regardless of what coffee it is. I'm not saying roast everything similar. I'm saying that in the difference between a really bad roasted coffee and a good roasted coffee, there's actually a lot of room to treat your coffee as coffee. So we here at April believes in diversifying as much as we can. We don't use any kind of single profile on all of our coffees. I don't believe that it's necessarily interesting. However, I don't believe that we work in the spectrum between bad coffee and good coffee. I believe we want to make different degrees of very good coffee, and therefore we're exploring and researching the approach to roasting. But if you are out there and you want to set up like a stable roasting process, then the idea of having a similar profile for example, each origin, each process method, is not necessarily a bad thing, because that will ensure you have a good quality to move into, right? Then it's a matter of when you're starting to roast to adapt what you want and what you want to get out of that coffee, and make sure that your quality control system of that profile actually makes a lot of sense. And in the end of the day, we can't stress enough that most of the quality that goes into a coffee happens outside of the roast machine, meaning, or when you're not roasting. So focus here needs to be green coffee and understanding, making sure the machine is performing the way that it should. I can't stress that enough, because if you don't have those variables locked in, it doesn't matter what you do, right? And the quality is not going to come through in the final cup. So really good green coffee that you know year to year is out of a certain quality, and that you have proper measurements to evaluate, is what's going to make your coffee better, together with the fact that you're on top of your machine, making sure that it's clean, performing consistent with all kind of variables. There's a lot of variables to think about here. And as I mentioned as well, push that same batch size, and that's just going to make your work so much easier, right? On a more technical thing, like as we told you, we're doing a bunch of measurements, right? So both on the green coffee, on the roasted coffee, and sensu-wise, it's just a quality control. Personally, we're big fans of Cropster. Cropster is really allowing us to gather a lot of data in the same place. And they've been really easy to work with in terms of customizing some forms and ideas that we have as well, which I believe is a big part of understanding, learning about your roasting over time. And if you have a way to go back and look at those previous profiles of that previous coffee, it's very easy to see how your roasting progress and how your roasting can become and should become better, right? So there is a lot of help to be found in different types of measurements, and in the end of the day, it just comes down to, how can I make this coffee tasty? On a more practical thing, what happens is that when we take in a new coffee, we put that alongside of a normal production line and focusing on test roasting. That is done in the normal size batch that we always use, and we can push 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 different profiles depending on where we are, depending on how that coffee is tasting, right? So we don't have a set system in terms of, okay, let's do X amount of batches of all the coffees that comes in. We're trying to stay on top of all of it and evaluate them for what it is. So if we're hitting something in terms of quality really quickly, we're more than happy to push that out. And if another coffee takes longer time, we will wait for that. A lot of it is really timing and understanding. Also, and something that we should add on, an experience that we had last year and most likely we'll have this year as well, is that, and on the subject of working with the same coffee year in, year out, it's pretty clear that some coffees are performing well at really different parts of the year, right? Almost regardless of when they're harvested. So you can have a Kenyan coffee that you started roasting from this harvest now. Let's say it's harvested January, you start roasting it in June, it tastes really bad and a bit green and a bit closed, and you give that 2 more months and it tastes really good. So there's a lot of opportunity there that comes with just understanding that green coffee and working with it continuously. Now, this was just to give you guys an idea about how we're working with profiling. If you have any questions, as usual, just write them down here. We're always happy to answer any comments, and we're going to keep on rolling those videos out as well. As always, if you like it, please share, and thank you for tuning in.